Hi, thank you for joining. We're going to continue now in the study of chapter 26 of Tanya, which is, as a whole, talking about the necessity of happiness and the benefit of happiness in a spiritual life. Last time we were discussing the concept of a light that comes from the darkness. And we said that this is more than the typical, had I not known the negative, I wouldn't be able to appreciate the positive. So you line up a dark period, and then you have a light or a revelation or a happy time, and you line them up next to each other, and that contrast makes the light appear greater. You can enjoy it more. That's not what we were saying. We were talking about a light coming from the darkness means that the light comes from the darkness itself, or from the other angle, the darkness is transformed into light. So he quotes a well-known verse from King Solomon that says, "V'ra'isi sheyesh yisrein l'chachma min hasichlis," that I have come to understand or appreciate the advantage of wisdom over foolishness, ki yisrein ha'or, like light, etc., over darkness. So the light here in this context is not an emotion, it's the idea of intelligence or wisdom over darkness, being in the dark, the idea of foolishness. And King Solomon comes and makes this bold statement, I can appreciate the advantage of wisdom or enlightenment over foolishness, like light over darkness. And the commentaries ask, well, what's the big deal? You need the wisest men on earth to tell you that. And the deeper meaning has to do with alluding to a light not only over darkness, because in Hebrew that word over, like if you compare two things, the superiority of light over darkness or intelligence over foolishness, that word over is also from. Min is from. So if you read the verse slightly differently, it's a light from the darkness, or intelligence that comes from foolishness, from something negative. You're actually have this transmutation into a higher level light or enlightenment and so forth. And then he adds these words, Ayin Sham, look there, do a better investigation, because now is not the time for it. V'dai lamaven, and it will suffice for those that can discern. Then he brings a support from the Torah itself, from the 5 books of Moses, a scriptural support, which says, Mala Davar Akasav, the verse, Tachas asher lo yavadata es Hashem aleikecha b'simcha, because you didn't serve God with joy. And the continuation of that verse is, well, all these things, it's the context of the curses in the Torah, which is, as a side note, something odd, interesting, worth investigating. There is no mention, as much as happiness is important, there is no mention in the whole Torah of a commandment to be happy. Really, the thrust of the advice to be happy comes in the context of discussing the exile and the worst things that happened to the Jewish people. And the simple meaning of that verse is, because when you had it good, and you had everything, and you had freedom from your enemies, and you had materially it was good, and you were dwelling in the land of Israel, and everything was great, you didn't appreciate that enough. Therefore, that's why all these negative things are going to happen. So the severity, the harshness of that type of contrast and punishment is another subject. But the deeper meaning is not because you didn't have a good, therefore this is going to happen to you. It's discussing more, and it says, pirush ha'rizal al pasuk zeh, as is known, the explanation of the Arizal, the Kabbalistic explanation of this, is telling you the quality of joy that you need to have. In other words, there are many different grades of happiness. There's like a contentment and a gratitude. What it's talking about here when it says a simple meroiv kel is not only a happiness that comes from having everything you need, like a contentment, it's something that should be meroiv kel, greater even in quality than the type of emotion that you feel just from being satisfied. So it's an extreme type of happiness. And the obvious question is, if it's telling you that that's really so important, how do you get there? And that's the subject that's coming next. It says, V'nei Eitza Yutza, the advice that we're going to give here, Latar Libai, to cleanse one's heart, Mikol Etzev Nidra Daiga Mimili Da'alma, from any trace of sadness or worry in the world that comes from a material lack. In other words, there's two departments which we discussed before. One is I'm sad because I have a lot going on in my life, certain things happen to me. The other is I'm sad because of how I feel inside about myself. So it has to do with spiritual matters. I'm not the type of person that I'm not living up to my standards. I did something I feel guilty about. That's one type of sadness. The other type of sadness is not about who you are, it's about what's happening to you. So that's what he addresses first. How are you supposed to cleanse your heart, your mind and your heart, of all these negative feelings about what's going on in your life that's happening to you? And the three departments in this area are Banai, which are children, meaning the things that touch people to the core are what is happening with their kids, or if somebody cannot have children, God forbid. The other is Chaye, which is like health, like something physically you don't feel well. And the other is Mazoinai, which is the idea of financial concerns. So children, health, and sustenance. How are you supposed to get over that to be able to be cleansed and feel this intense joy? So the first thing he says is, everybody knows the statement of the sages. And what is that statement? Kashem shemavarach al hatova, just like you have an obligation to make a blessing when good things happen to you. Like when something positive happens, there's an obligation. It discusses in the Mishnah, a bunch of them, depending on what happens to you. So in the Tractate of Blessings, which the sages carved out a different language for many different types of benefits that a person has, to be able to call attention, to be able to appreciate what's going on. So whether it be food, that's one type of blessing, or when you reach a certain milestone, it's another type of blessing, something positive that gives you excitement. So there's all these blessings that you say, which one would think is only when something good happens. But the Mishnah, incidentally, and this is worth noting, it's not in Jewish mysticism or philosophy or ethics that it's telling you, hey, you should make a blessing when something negative happens. It's in the Mishnah. The Mishnah tells you that just like you're obligated when something good happens to praise God, there is also a type of blessing when something negative happens. And that is totally counterintuitive, because you would think that you wouldn't thank God for what is causing you suffering or what appears to be negative. Yet, the Mishnah says, just like you're obligated to show gratitude for the positive, you're obligated to make a blessing for the quote-unquote bad. Upirusha b'Gemara, and the Gemara explains what this means. Likboile b'simcha, whatever happens to you, receive it with joy. Kamai simchas haytova haniglas v'anirs, just like the type of happiness that brews or that comes forth from something that's revealed good. So you have two categories of good that we're going to get into here. You have the type of good where it's obvious, meaning you can appreciate it. It's sweet to you. It's palatable. It's like obvious. If somebody just has this beautiful child that they've been waiting a long time to have, and it's a new addition in their life, it's like an obvious blessing. If someone just closes a deal and it's career changing, it's a game changer for them, and they've been working so hard to try to persuade the potential client, obviously that's good. These things are, you don't need to say to somebody like, oh, if you look closely, you'll see that this is good. That's obvious good. Then there's a type of good which is not revealed, and that is what we try to stay away from. Things that make us upset, that we don't want, that we want to prevent, and we label that as bad. But the approach taken here is when something negative like that happens to you, you have to, at that point, it's not a question of faking it, you have to make a blessing to instill in your mind that this is the same thing as what you would say is revealed good. It's just something that you can't see right now as good. And that's what he says next. Ki gamzu l'toiva. This itself is also good. Rak she'enad niglis v'niras la'ena basar. It's just that it's not visible to the naked eye. You don't see the good yet. Ki hi ma'alma diskasya, because it comes from the hidden worlds. So if we pause here, this itself is one of the most difficult concepts to grasp, but yet the most important in the spiritual progress and service in a person's life, is how do you deal with your connection to God or your view of God when something negative happens to you. And let's first separate the idea of a tragedy or a death. When something like that happens, I don't care who it is, you can never come out and say that, like, oh, this is actually good, we don't see it. And we're not talking about, obviously, the death of a murderer. If somebody is a murderer and they are an evil person and they're killed, so that you could say, I can understand how it's good or beneficial for society. Here we're talking about the death of a loved one or a tragedy that happens. That's it. You cannot take it back, and you will never see the good in this life. So we're not talking about that. But there are other events where you can have the approach of gamzu l'toiva, which this also is for my benefit or for the good. And in this itself, there are two, probably a few, but let's just say 2 or 3 general levels. One of the levels is, this too shall pass. Like, I really am uncomfortable right now. It's a bad point in my life. Everyone goes through tough times, but I have full faith and confidence and trust in God, even while this is happening, that this too will pass, and I'll make it through this. So that's a positive attitude, and it's a connection to God, but it's not the ideal level. Then you have another, which is an attitude, maybe let's say a higher level of Kol derachman avid, the Tov avid, that everything that the merciful one does, that God does, there is a good reason for it. Like people say, everything happens for a reason. That idea that everything happens for a reason means that, okay, I trust that what's going on, not only am I trying to escape it, oh, just let this pass already, or I'll get through it, but this too is for a good reason. And sometimes in hindsight you can say, well, I see what that reason is. And to give an extreme example, you can have somebody, they're about to take a plane and they get stuck in the bathroom, and the famous story, and then the plane crashes. So I know people that have been scheduled on flights and they canceled the flight to make because they regretted missing a family event before, and that appeared negative, and they beat themselves up for it. Why? How could I miss my daughter's graduation or whatever? But then they were supposed to fly on a plane, and they canceled that event, canceled the flight, in order to make it to another family event, and that flight went down. So if you look and you say, initially, that was a unfortunate thing that I missed my flight, that's negative, a tiny negative thing that happened that causes discomfort, but your life gets saved. And there's famous stories in the Talmud to illustrate that point with Rabbi Akiva, that this too ended up being for his benefit. But if you actually look at that negative event, let's say missing the plane, or if we take a less extreme example, something bad happened to me and it saved me from having to go through something else, that event still remains negative. It's just that you see the hand of God involved, that it ended up being for your benefit in some way. But that's not the highest level. The highest level is when you can actually look, and this is getting back to the idea of a light that comes from the darkness, where you can actually look and see that that suffering or dark period or negative event that occurred, that you were so convinced at one time was just not good for you, ended up being more to your advantage than if things had continued or progressed the way that you wanted them to go. And we can all take a step back and reflect on situations like that in our life where it was dark and it looked like it's negative. And then when you look back, you say, but that taught me something. I would never ever have gained whatever it is or become the person that I became or learned a certain lesson which ended up helping me more than I could have imagined, so that what I thought was negative actually ended up also being good in a revealed way. That's the highest level. That's obviously when a person trusts in God that what's happening to them is ultimately going to turn out good. That's the type of good that you want it to be. You don't want it to only be like, oh, it passed and I made it through it, so I became stronger. And you don't only want it to be like, oh, well, I dodged a bullet and that's why it happened. You want it to also be that I can see how that benefited me in a way that I grew. And that's what we're going to get into next time, this concept of Gam Zu L'Toiva. This too is for the good. And that type of good is from a higher level of closeness to God. In other words, during that time that a person is suffering, it's actually bringing them to a deeper point in their connection to God. And most people view sometimes the sad times or negative times or suffering as something they just want to get through. And if somebody goes through a difficult period and comes and feels like they deepen their connection to God, or even they found God through that, a lot of times people from the outside look at that as a weakness. Like when I sometimes have the discussion with people and they would say to me, well, how did you become more interested, more observant? So I said to this guy, it was like we were sitting at lunch, and he was a really bitter person in regard to religion. He was the son of survivors, so already you have this like, oh, well, obviously there's no God because look at what happened. And then during the lunch, he was taking every opportunity to kind of test me and mock religion and mock God and so forth. But it was okay. He was a good guy, and I was joking with him and so forth. So he asked me the question, well, how did you become, more religious? I made some comment to him about what I was going through at the time and how I was searching and thinking. So he said, oh, you were searching. So I say, well, is that a weakness? To be thinking about life, to be pushed and squeezed to where you actually have to get to the essence of everything? Is that a weakness? And it looked like, well, obviously, because you came from a low position, so it can't really be true. The reason why you turned to religion is it was like a crutch. You needed something during that time. That's one perspective. So you were searching, so obviously you were looking for something and you just took whatever you can. That's the lame, outside, immature understanding of this concept. The deeper understanding is that when things are good, you don't often reflect, and you're not forced to dig deep and to reevaluate the way that you were brought up, the way that you think about things. You just continue with the way things are going, the way other people are acting around you, and you're not really forced to reevaluate anything. But then when you suffer, you say to yourself, well, I better start searching and figuring out, is there anything? That's when you really get to truth. It's the opposite of what people think. It's not necessarily like a crutch. It can definitely fill a void, but sometimes you find the truth more when you're going through difficult times. And if it wasn't for the difficult times, you would have never gone inward as much to ask the questions, to question God and question life, and then you would have never discovered what it is that you saw. So this idea that during difficult times it's actually a deeper closeness to God, we're going to look at that concept more on a mystical level, of how when you get revealed good, that's actually a superficial spiritual gift. But the more precious spiritual gift is when you get pulled into what causes you some type of pain. That event, the way it's orchestrated, is actually leading you to a deeper connection and closeness to God. And if you can recognize it during that period, then you can change the whole way things unfold after that, by actually being conscious at the time that the pain that you're going through is from a level of hidden good and a greater closeness to God. So that's what we will discuss next time. Thank you for watching, and may we only see revealed good.